So these are the varieties of fish that we looked at for our seafood study here. We had some fresh tuna, some fresh wild Alaskan salmon, some farm-raised organic salmon. We had some frozen tuna, some marlin steaks, swordfish steaks, and a fresh black pearl salmon. Samples of these different fish were taken and digested using high-purity nitric acid, peroxide, and distilled water. After the digestion, they were diluted with more distilled water and then diluted 1 to 10 before analysis doing ICP and ICP-MS. With our ICP and our ICP-MS, we were looking for trace metals and we were looking for major toxic metals such as mercury. We used reference materials that we create here at SPEX CertIPrep. We have some certified reference materials that I have listed here, and we use these to calibrate over the expected concentration range of our samples. We also did sample matrix matching for these standards. We also had a NIST certified standard, which we processed along with our fish and analyzed as a control. This is a table of some of the results that we found in our various fish samples. Some of these are very positive elements to have in your diet, such as calcium, iron, potassium, magnesium. And you can see that there's a wide range of results for each of these elements. And that fish in general is a very good source of things like potassium and phosphorus. There's also some different ranges of numbers for iron. This tuna has a very large amount of iron compared to this black pearl farm-raised salmon. So if you're looking for more iron in your diet, the dark tuna would have been a better choice here. If we look now just for the mercury, if we look at a typical 4-ounce serving in micrograms, we have a large range of mercury that we found in our different fish samples. Our salmons were virtually identical, between 3.5 and 5 micrograms in a 4-ounce serving. Now, if we look at the allowable daily limit of mercury this is based on a normal adult diet, we would be hitting about 63, almost 64% of an adult's daily serving of mercury for these different salmon samples. And it would be about between 6 and 9% for a weekly allowable daily limit, or allowable weekly limit, excuse me. But if we get down now to these marlin steaks and swordfish, the game fish, we're looking at fish that are very slow growing, they're fairly long-lived, and they have a longer chance and a better chance of these materials collecting in their tissues. You start to have much higher mercury results. In fact, the swordfish steaks had 111 micrograms in a 4-ounce serving, and the marlin steaks had way over 300 micrograms in a 4-ounce serving. So what does that mean if you're going to eat a marlin steak or you're going to eat a swordfish steak? Well, you should be aware that the percentage of your allowable daily limit for that swordfish steak will put you way over the 1,000%. So you've exceeded your daily limit by 1,000% by eating that swordfish steak. And you've exceeded your weekly limit by almost 200%. Now for marlin steaks, the news is a little worse, actually a lot worse. If you look at how much you're allowed in a daily serving of mercury, if you ate that marlin steak, you would be in the 4,000 range of how far over your daily limit you were. And in your weekly limit, you'd be close to 600% over your your weekly limit. There's an interesting mercury calculator at this website here, and you can actually put in your weight and the type of fish you're planning on eating, and how many ounces of this fish you plan on eating this week. And according to the EPA and the FDA studies and the EPA data, it will show you how much mercury exposure, and you can create your own little table of what your percentage of your weekly limit would be. So what did we find for mercury content? Well, there were no real differences in the mercury levels between the different types of salmon. And when it comes to tuna, we found that the frozen tuna actually had higher levels of mercury than our fresh tuna. Another interesting thing that we found out about the seafood samples that we were looking at is it seemed that the higher the mercury levels we found, they were for, again, game fish or very dense type of fish, things like swordfish and marlin steaks and shark. And both of the swordfish and the marlin steaks exceeded EPA guideline limits. Going back to the tuna, imported tuna also seemed to have a higher level of mercury than U.S. tuna. And if we looked at the studies around different imported tunas, Asian tuna were the lowest of the imported tuna in regards to mercury, and Latin American tuna were the highest, and sometimes exceeding the legal limits of mercury. Now we come to the selenium paradox. Selenium is an essential element in the human diet, and when we consider that mercury is a dangerous toxic element potential in fish, we have to consider mercury alone is not just a risk indicator. There are things that can offset the mercury. There are other elements that interact with mercury, and selenium has a very high binding affinity for mercury. There was a Japanese study that showed that adding selenium to the diet of birds actually increased their protection from mercury toxicity. And as I said before, selenium is a very important mineral in the diet. It's necessary for cellular function and enzyme creation. And in the body, there is a selenium-dependent enzyme synthesis. There was a study done on Madison, Wisconsin fish that shows the different ratios that were found between the different types of fish and selenium and mercury. If we look at this one red line here, this is the 1-to-1 ratio where the levels of selenium and mercury are basically equal. And so you lose quite a bit of the protection or the effective protection of the selenium. So when you look down at this very end of the table here you find those more game fish, the mahi-mahi and the swordfish, the other dense and slow-growing fish where it had high levels of mercury to begin with, but they also have low levels of selenium. So you have this ratio which is very close to 1 and it has the least amount of protection from that selenium. If you go to the other end, you have more of these fast-growing smaller fish, the cod and the trout and the whitefish, where these ratios are much higher. We look at our own samples that we did here at SPEX CertIPrep. We found that salmon had a ratio, selenium and mercury ratio between 4 and 11. Tuna had a ratio between 3 and 10, with the Wisconsin study reporting for the similar tuna between 2 and 25. These game fish for us had a ratio of less than 1. So it shows a very low ratio between the selenium and the mercury. And in the Wisconsin study, the swordfish had a ratio of 1. So what can we conclude about seafood? Well, in regards to mercury levels, the marlin and the swordfish had the highest mercury levels, and in this case, they actually exceeded the EPA's reference dosage limits for the day. For tuna, we found that frozen tuna actually had higher levels of mercury than the fresh tuna. And imported tuna had higher levels of mercury than domestic tuna. If you were going to eat imported tuna, it was found that Asian tuna levels were the lowest of the import tunas, while South American tuna had the highest level of mercury of all the import tunas. So the health benefits of eating fish, do they outweigh the dangers? There have been many health studies that show that the benefits of eating fish actually decrease your mortality rate. So there's a statistic that mortality rate from heart disease was actually 30% lower from those eating fish twice a week than those who did not eat fish. And the overall mortality rate for those who do eat seafood was about 17% lower. So the EPA and the FDA make recommendations for fish consumption. And there's a nice little chart from the Bureau of Health Environmental Toxicity Program here, which has a little diagram of the levels of mercury in each of the different types of seafood. And down here at the bottom with very high mercury are these game fish, the swordfish and the shark, and up to the top are the shellfish and the flounder and the pollock and the cod, these smaller, lighter fish. So the FDA and the EPA advise that you avoid shark and swordfish and other types of game fish like marlin and tilefish. The alternatives are things like canned light tuna, salmon, pollock, catfish, and they suggest you eat up to 12 ounces or 2 average meals a week of seafood that is low in mercury. They also say that if you eat locally caught fish, please check your advisories for the safety of those locally caught fish. And if there is no information available, eat less than 6 ounces a week of these locally caught fish.